The sit-ins continued throughout the South with considerable success. Integration was accomplished in hundreds of communities. Then, in March of 1961, the protests were extended into the Freedom Rides, which were designed to desegregate interstate buses and bus terminals in the South. Although the Freedom Rides were primarily a project of the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, they had the backing of the SCLC and SNCC, and Martin served as chairman of the Freedom Rides Coordinating Committee. On April 28th, James Farmer of CORE wrote to President Kennedy telling him the itinerary of the first Freedom Ride. On May 4th, pairs of white and black volunteers with a white observer from CORE took Greyhound and Trailways buses for a trip through Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi to New Orleans. This well advertised project seemed to infuriate Southern reactionaries beyond all reason. Bands of raging whites attacked the buses in cities in the deep southern states. The riders were hauled off, beaten up, and thrown into jails. In Anniston, Alabama, a roaring crowd attacked a Greyhound bus, smashed its windows with iron bars, punctured the tires, and threw an incendiary bomb into it. The bus was destroyed. This was the largest violent attack that the people of the movement had experienced thus far. I remember seeing television pictures of the bus burning, and it was a gruesome, frightening thing. Martin was terribly concerned for the safety of our people. He also knew that the senseless violence of the whites could provoke our people to retaliation. The Freedom Rides continued and the attacks grew in intensity. Martin joined in appeals to the federal government for protection for the Freedom Riders. The Kennedy administration assured us that it would stay in close touch with those developments. Meanwhile, another group of Freedom Riders was due to arrive in Montgomery on May 20th. Martin went there to meet them. He told me how a mob of 300 people surrounded the bus as it stopped. The first rider off was a white exchange student from Fisk University named James Zwerg. Women screamed, "Kill the nigger-loving son of a bee." Men rushed in to knock him down and beat him unconscious. However, true to our nonviolent principles, James Zwerg made no attempt to defend himself. He lay unconscious in the street for an hour before an ambulance came. Others getting off the bus, including John Siegenthaler of the Justice Department, who later became the publisher of the Nashville Tennessean, was beaten. Some were spirited safely away in cars driven by members of the Montgomery Improvement Association. For 20 horrible minutes, the police did nothing to stop the terrible attacks on the people. Throughout the day, there were eruptions of violence. Then, as darkness fell, the federal government sent 600 United States Marshals into the city to restore order. Governor John Patterson of Alabama contended that there was no need for federal intervention and threatened to arrest the marshals. "We can handle the situation ourselves," he said. Of course, the governor's idea of how to handle the situation seemed to be to let the mob take over. Meanwhile, the radio announced that Martin Luther King Jr. would hold a mass rally for the Freedom Riders at Ralph Abernathy's First Baptist Church. 1,200 whites and blacks were jammed into the church as carloads of angry white racists poured into Montgomery from the countryside. A crowd of several thousand surrounded the church. Martin said rocks began crashing through the stained glass windows, showering the close-packed crowd with splintered glass. Maddened elements in the mob began shouting that the church should be burned. My husband rushed to the telephone and called Attorney General Robert Kennedy in Washington to send more marshals to help those already present who seemed barely able to keep the crowd from breaking into the church. Martin stood before that brave and beleaguered assembly, and while rocks continued to crash into the sanctuary, the people prayed and sang hymns freedom songs, and "We Shall Overcome." After they had been besieged for several hours, things seemed quieter, and Martin decided to see if he could talk the crowd outside into letting them leave the church. He and Ralph Abernathy stepped through the front door. As Martin came out, a gas bomb whizzed by within a few inches of his head. One of his aides, who was very close to him, Reverend Fred C. Bennett, picked up the bomb and threw it over Martin's shoulder. Someone pulled him back inside the church, and there he stayed with all the people through most of the night. This action was typical of the kind of devotion to Martin displayed by many of the people closely associated with him in the movement. Often, when there was the possibility that he would be injured, they would place themselves in the path of danger in an effort to protect him. Always unarmed, they were willing to give their own lives, if need be, in order to spare his. Martin's selfless devotion to the cause inspired this response from them. Eventually, the reinforced marshals were able to disperse the mob, and by daylight, the people were able to go home. But it was a night of horror, and it was very discouraging because it revealed the irrationality and cruelty of racism. That whole summer, the Freedom Rides continued, and they accomplished a good deal. The Freedom Rides took the movement from the college campuses, which were primarily located in cities, to the rural hamlets of the Southland. The idealistic youth who went to Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and southwest Georgia were to give the movement its broad rural base as they moved from campus to community. Thus, the movement of Southern ministers who followed my husband's pattern of bus protests gained a welcome ally in Southern college students who committed themselves to nonviolent action. At about this time, the Field Foundation gave a grant of $45,000 for a voter education program under the auspices of the United Church of Christ, and a young black minister, Andrew J. Young, was chosen to administer it in close association with Martin. Andy Young later joined the staff of SCLC and became one of Martin's closest friends and colleagues. He served first as administrative assistant to Martin, then as executive director of SCLC, and finally as executive vice president, the position he held at the time of Martin's death. He is now a member of SCLC's board of directors. He has served as a congressman, U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and mayor of Atlanta. The Reverend James Bevel came to us from the Nashville student movement. Later, his wife, the former Diane Nash, also joined our staff. James Orange is still very active and is one of the finest organizers who has kept in touch with young people. Down south, anybody having a march calls James Orange to coordinate it because he is about the only one left who is doing that sort of thing. Willie Bolden, Lester Hankerson, and Ben Clark came by way of the Savannah movement, which was led by the dynamic Hosea Williams. Martin and Hosea had conflicts, but my husband said Hosea had more raw courage than anybody he ever met. Hosea was one of those people who could get out and relate to the street folks, which was a great help to Martin. He was also a master at organizing marches. Bernard Lafayette, the senior scholar in residence at the King Center, has probably done more nonviolent training than anyone else since my husband's death. He is the present program director and a product of the student movement. Walter Fauntroy became the first non-voting delegate in Congress from Washington, D.C. Septima Clark brought to the SCLC citizenship education program valuable insights gained from her experiences teaching adult education in her native Charleston, South Carolina. Dorothy Cotton was the only woman on the executive staff of the SCLC. She paid a lot of dues, too. She was beaten, went to jails, and so on. It is difficult to name everyone who contributed in some way to the success of SCLC. Yet, these people and others whose names do not appear in our story are certainly among the most valuable persons who worked with my husband during his 12 and 1/2 years of struggle in the movement. The combination of youth, intellect, and dedication, as well as wisdom in the SCLC organization, created for the conference an enviable place among organizations working for social change. SCLC's next campaign led Martin to Albany, Georgia. Albany has about 50-odd thousand inhabitants and is approximately 270 miles southwest of Atlanta, in the heart of the hardcore white racist country. It was then totally segregated. The Albany movement, as it was generally called, was headed by a respected African American physician, William G. Anderson, and it was inspired by two very young SNCC field workers, Charles Sherrod and Cordell Reagan, who had established a voter registration center there. Its sponsors were the Ministerial Alliance of Albany, the Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, SNCC, the local NAACP branch, and the Negro Voters League. The organization set out to copy the program of the Montgomery Improvement Association. On November 25, 1961, the movement began when 3 black young people and 2 adults sat down in the bus terminal dining room and asked to be served. They were arrested. On December 10th, a group of Freedom Riders, including SCLC's youth director Bernard Lee, arrived. Bernard, who died in 1991, traveled with my husband constantly and could handle crowds better than anyone I have ever seen. The riders came to help a group who were trying to integrate the railroad station. They were jailed. Then, on December 15, a unit of the Georgia National Guard was mobilized at the request of Mayor Asa Kelly of Albany. Dr. Anderson telephoned Martin for help. The Albany movement began before Martin became involved. Martin, who was then concentrating on the unification of a national movement, did not feel that it was the time for our strength to be diffused in local confrontations, which might better be settled by national action. Nevertheless, his conscience and his sense of obligations to the leadership made him go at once to try to help. Martin and Ralph Abernathy arrived in Albany that very evening after Dr. Anderson's call. The next morning, they marched at the head of a procession of 250 people to the city hall. Every one of the marchers was arrested. Negotiations followed this mass arrest. The city commissioners agreed to desegregate the bus terminal and railroad station, and in return the protesters agreed to halt mass demonstrations. The prisoners were released. At the end of December, the bus company agreed to desegregate the buses, though the commissioners refused to make it official. Martin later thought that it would have been better strategy to have temporarily accepted these gains and held back for a while until the community could peacefully adjust to the changes. But the leaders of the Albany movement had tasted victory and they wanted to continue, and Martin himself encouraged them to do so. He suggested a boycott of selected stores, but because he did not have the time to supervise the organization, it was largely ineffective. On February 27, 1962, Martin, Ralph, and several others were tried and convicted for leading the December march in Albany. They were not sentenced until July 10, when the judge gave Martin and Ralph the choice of a fine of $178 or 45 days at hard labor. In accordance with their principles, both men refused to pay the fine, but, taking the example of Commissioner Clyde Sellers in Montgomery, someone was smart enough to pay their fines for them, and they were ejected from jail. Throughout that summer of 1962, the struggle continued in Albany. but the city commissioners were adamant against any further concessions. Rather than integrate the city parks, they closed them. They also closed the public library. One redeeming aspect of that period was that Police Chief Larry Pritchett was not at all typical of Southern policemen. He was not brutal, though some of his officers engaged in brutality. He tried to be decent, and as a person, he displayed kindness. He would allow the protesters to demonstrate up to a point. Then he would say, "Now we're going to break this up. If you don't disperse, you'll be arrested." Our people were given fair warning. Often they would refuse to disperse and would drop on their knees and pray. Chief Pritchett would bow his head with them while they prayed. Then, of course, he would arrest them, and the people would go to jail singing. Many people came from other states to help the Albany movement. 75 ministers, priests, and rabbis, black and white, Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish, came to pray and were arrested. In July, there was a violent outburst when 2,000 young people threw rocks and pop bottles at the police. Martin called for a day of penitence for this disorder. He also insisted that for the rest of the week, direct action would be confined to prayer vigils. On July 27, Martin, Ralph, and Dr. Anderson led the first of these vigils. They were arrested and jailed. Their trial was set for August 10, which meant that they would be in prison for nearly 2 weeks. I was in Atlanta with our 3 children. Our second son, Dexter, named for our beloved church in Montgomery, had been born in January 1961 and was still an infant. I drove over from Atlanta to see Martin frequently. Chief Pritchett was very decent to the prisoners, though we knew of many instances of brutality inside the jail from bigoted white prison guards. He allowed food to be brought to them, and he let Martin have books and a radio in his cell. The jail was very dirty, but they cleaned up the part he was in. I could smell the disinfectant every time I went there. One day I took the 2 oldest children with me. It was the first time Yoki and Marty saw their father in jail. However, he was allowed out in the corridor to talk to them, so they did not see him behind bars. It did not seem to bother them at all. They played happily up and down the corridors. We all expected that the men would get a jail sentence at their trial, so when the idea was conceived that the wives of the leaders should lead a demonstration after the hearing, we were terribly excited. Juanita Abernathy, Andy Young's wife, Jean, Dr. Anderson's wife, Norma, Wyatt Walker's wife, Anne, Slater King's wife, Marion, C.B. King's wife, Carol. Slater and C.B. King were lawyers for the Albany movement. James Bevel's wife, Diane, and I were going to lead the march. We thought that if we could get a number of women in jail, it would be a dramatic way of getting our case before the American public, which might then put pressure on the local authorities. So strong was the support of the female contingent of the Albany movement that one member, Diane Nash Bevel, who was 9 months pregnant, refused to go home and had her baby in Albany during this period. But at the trial, Martin and Ralph Abernathy were given suspended sentences and released. I must confess that I was very disappointed because I had looked forward to going to jail the next day. Martin and Ralph were freed on a weekend, and they immediately began to organize a huge, massive demonstration for Monday. Somehow the word got out. I imagine our strategy meetings were bugged, and there were always lots of police around outside. This time the city officials succeeded in getting a federal injunction against the demonstration. This was the first time local officials had ever succeeded in getting the federal courts to enjoin one of our demonstrations. I remember that my husband was much disturbed. He spent hours trying to decide whether to obey the injunction or not. His argument had always been that we were breaking local laws in order to obey the federal law. This time it was the federal law that was in question. The federal courts in the South had demonstrated their intention to be fair, but now we were confronted with a situation in which these very courts were enjoining us. Martin had to think the problem through very, very carefully and assess all the implications. Many of the leaders, especially the student leaders, felt Martin should disobey the injunction. Martin called Attorney General Robert Kennedy and also Burke Marshall of the Justice Department. And I remember he was quite annoyed because they did not seem to understand our plight. They suggested it might be wise to close up in Albany, Martin said. You know, they just don't understand what we're up against. He was terribly disappointed. I remember quite vividly how he agonized that night after the mass meeting. The possibility of calling off the demonstration had already affected the morale of the staff and people involved in the movement. Most of the staff came to sleep at Dr. Anderson's house, headquarters for the Albany movement, where we always stayed while there. Martin needed desperately to have a strategy session with his staff and workers. When he looked around, the key people had fallen asleep. The occasion reminded me of Christ and the experience with his disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane. I felt deeply for Martin. We finally went to bed, and his was indeed a restless night. Out of his agony and prayerful deliberation, he decided not to march. Later, he felt that this was the factor that broke the backbone of the Albany movement. When they could not demonstrate, the movement lost its momentum. Martin was to regret this decision. He later said, now that they're successful in getting a federal injunction, they're going to do it over and over again, and that means we will be stymied. My husband was severely criticized by some people. My husband was severely criticized by some people for obeying this federal ruling. Yet, since the federal government had always supported us on constitutional questions, it was difficult for Martin to go against it. It had been the only friend we had had in the South. Though we had many problems with the Albany movement, it gave the people of Albany a new sense of dignity and respect, and an awareness of their plight that they did not have before. The success was not as dramatic as it was in Montgomery, and did not have the additional impact, did not have the national impact of Montgomery. But each community has to be involved in its own struggle for freedom. The movement in Albany did lay the groundwork for many later reforms in southwest Georgia. The freedom spirit spread rapidly to surrounding counties. Also, the SCLC staff learned many valuable lessons in community mobilization, which were soon to bear fruit in Birmingham.